What would you do if you witnessed injustice right before your eyes? For Royal Guard Daniel Mitchell, this question wasn't theoretical. It was a split-second decision that would change multiple lives forever. This is the extraordinary story of duty, courage, and standing up for what's right, even when the stakes are high. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to never miss inspiring stories like this one. The morning sun cast long shadows across Windsor Palace's ancient stones, painting the centuries-old walls in hues of gold and amber. Tourist season was in full swing, and the Grand East Gate buzzed with excitement as visitors from around the world gathered to witness the legendary precision of the Royal Guards. Daniel Mitchell stood at attention, his crisp scarlet uniform a stark contrast against the palace's weathered stone walls. At 28, he was one of the younger guards, but his military background and unwavering dedication had quickly earned him respect among his peers. The weight of his ceremonial rifle felt familiar in his hands, a reminder of the tradition and responsibility he carried. Tourists shuffled past, their cameras clicking incessantly. Children pointed and whispered, some trying to catch his eye or make him smile. But Dan remained motionless, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency. 3 years of guard duty had taught him to observe everything while appearing to look at nothing. Sarah Palmer, the cheerful tourist information officer, was giving her usual morning tour. "The guards you see before you represent centuries of tradition," she explained to her attentive audience. "They're not just ceremonial figures, they're highly trained military personnel." Dan allowed himself a small measure of pride at her words. Too many people thought guards were mere statues in fancy uniforms. They didn't know about the years of military service, the rigorous training, or the real responsibility they carried. The morning progressed like any other, until Dan noticed something unusual near the Memorial Gardens. A group of young men had been loitering there for over an hour, their behavior growing increasingly suspicious. They weren't taking photos or reading tourist information. Instead, they seemed to be watching people, particularly those who appeared vulnerable or elderly. Through subtle shifts in his stance, Dan maintained his surveillance while keeping up his ceremonial pose. His fellow guard, Rachel Cooper, was positioned at the opposite corner, and he could tell from her slightly altered posture that she'd noticed them too. The leader of the group, a tall man with a distinctive scar that Dan would later know as Kevin Morris, kept checking his phone and whispering to his companions. Something about their body language set off warning bells in Dan's mind. The way they positioned themselves, how they sized up passers-by, the predatory glances they exchanged. The palace grounds were starting to fill with the usual mid-morning crowd. Tour groups clustered around their guides. Children ran along the paths, while their parents called after them, and elderly visitors rested on benches in the Memorial Gardens. The scene appeared peaceful, but Dan could feel tension building beneath the surface. Captain Thomas Blackwood passed by on his morning inspection, his polished boots clicking against the cobblestones. He gave Dan an almost imperceptible nod of approval. To outsiders, it would have looked like nothing at all, but Dan knew his captain appreciated his attention to detail. A cool breeze carried the scent of roses from the Memorial Gardens, where the palace gardeners had been working since dawn. The flowers were in full bloom, their colors providing a stunning backdrop for tourist photographs. But Dan's attention remained fixed on the group of men who had now moved closer to the East Gate. Their leader, Morris, was wearing an expensive leather jacket despite the warm weather. His companions, Jake Turner, Steve Walsh, and Mark Reynolds, were dressed more casually, but moved with the same predatory awareness. They seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. The palace clock struck 10, its deep chimes echoing across the grounds. Dan knew the changing of the guard would happen in 2 hours. Until then, he would maintain his post, watching and waiting, ready to act if needed. Little did he know, that this ordinary morning was about to transform into one of the most challenging days of his career. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will inspire you. Hit that notification bell to stay updated on our latest uploads. Leave a comment below sharing what you would do in a similar situation. The mid-morning sun climbed higher over Windsor Palace as Daniel Mitchell reflected on his journey to becoming a royal guard. Standing at attention near the East Gate, his mind wandered to his first day of training while maintaining his unwavering external composure. 3 years had transformed him from a newly discharged military serviceman into one of the palace's most respected guards. Dan's daily routine started long before tourists arrived. He woke at 4:30 a.m., spending an hour ensuring his uniform met the exact standards required of his position. Every brass button needed to shine like a mirror, each pleat in his trousers had to fall perfectly, and his ceremonial rifle required meticulous cleaning. His fellow guards often joked that he could spot a speck of dust from 20 paces, but this attention to detail had earned him Captain Blackwood's trust. Today had begun like any other, with Dan arriving at the guards' quarter well before sunrise. The pre-dawn quiet of the palace grounds always gave him time to center himself, to remember the weight of tradition he carried on his shoulders. As he'd polished his boots in the dim light of the barracks, Rachel Cooper had stopped by his station. "You're early again, Dan," she'd said, adjusting her own uniform in the mirror. "Captain's starting to think you sleep here." "Better early than sorry," he'd replied, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Remember last month when Turner almost missed inspection because of traffic?" They'd shared a knowing look, remembering how Jake Turner, one of the newer guards, had barely made it to his post on time. In their line of work, almost late was as good as late. There was no room for compromise when it came to palace security. Now, as Dan maintained his post, he could see Rachel across the courtyard, her posture as perfect as ever. They'd developed an unspoken language over the years, subtle signals that tourists never noticed, but that helped them coordinate their surveillance of the grounds. The tourist crowds grew thicker as the morning wore on. Dan observed each face, each gesture, each suspicious movement with practiced ease. His military training had taught him to notice details others might miss. A nervous hand in a pocket, a glance that lingered too long, a person who seemed out of place among the cheerful visitors. Sarah Palmer's voice carried across the courtyard as she led another tour group. The Royal Guards undergo months of intensive training before taking their posts, she explained. They maintain absolute discipline regardless of distractions. As if to test her words, a young child broke away from his parents and ran straight toward Dan, making funny faces and waving his arms. Dan didn't flinch, though his eyes tracked the boy's movement until his embarrassed mother collected him. This was the kind of situation they trained for, maintaining composure while staying alert to real threats. Captain Blackwood appeared for his second morning inspection, his keen eyes scanning every detail of Dan's appearance and position. The captain had served in the same military unit as Dan's father years ago, though he never showed favoritism. If anything, he held Dan to an even higher standard. "Mitchell," Blackwood murmured as he passed, his voice barely audible. "Notice anything unusual this morning?" "Yes, sir," Dan replied, his lips barely moving. "Group of 4 men by the memorial. Gardens. Been watching the crowds for over an hour." Blackwood gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Keep an eye on them. Cooper's been notified." The exchange lasted seconds, invisible to casual observers. This was how they operated. Precise, professional, always alert. Dan had learned early that being a royal guard meant more than standing still and looking impressive. They were the palace's first line of defense, its watchful protectors. Through the corner of his eye, Dan observed the group of men again. Their leader, Kevin Morris, had moved closer to the palace entrance, his scarred face partially hidden beneath a baseball cap. His companions spread out among the tourists, their movements too coordinated to be casual. A memory flashed through Dan's mind. His first week on duty, when he'd helped catch a pickpocket targeting elderly visitors. The thief had shown similar behavior, testing security responses before attempting anything. But these men seemed different, more organized, more purposeful. The palace clock chimed 11, and Dan prepared for the mid-morning shift change. This was always a crucial moment. Tourists would cluster closer, trying to capture photos of the ceremonial guard. Change, creating perfect cover for anyone with ill intent. George Matthews, the gate security officer, was checking visitors' bags with his usual thoroughness. Dan noticed him pay special attention to anyone who came near Morris and his group, though he maintained a professional demeanor that wouldn't alert the suspects.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
As Dan waited for his relief to arrive, he caught Rachel's subtle signal. 3 fingers brushed against her rifle, their code for potential trouble. She'd noticed something about the suspicious group that concerned her. Dan responded with an equally subtle gesture, acknowledging her warning. The weight of his ceremonial rifle felt reassuring in his hands. Though primarily for show, the weapon represented centuries of tradition and responsibility. Dan remembered his father's words. When he'd first joined the Royal Guards, "It's not about standing still, son. It's about standing ready." Those words echoed in his mind as he observed Morris whispering to his companions. Whatever they were planning, Dan knew it would happen soon. Years of military service and guard duty had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct now told him to stay alert. A tour bus arrived at the East Gate, disgorging another group of excited visitors. Among them, Dan noticed an elderly gentleman walking with quiet dignity, his jacket bearing military medals. Something about the man's bearing caught Morris's attention too. Dan saw the group leader nudge his companions and gesture subtly toward the veteran. The morning sun now cast shorter shadows across the courtyard as noon approached. Dan's shift would normally end soon, but he had a feeling today wouldn't follow the usual routine. Captain Blackwood had circled back to his position, this time with a more urgent message. "Relief's been delayed 10 minutes, he muttered. "Keep your post until further notice." Dan understood the implication. Something was happening, and the captain wanted his most observant guard in position. He squared his shoulders imperceptibly, preparing for whatever might come. This was what they trained for, what separated real royal guards from ceremonial figures. Through it all, Dan maintained his statuesque pose, his eyes forward, his bearing perfect. Tourists continued to pose beside him for photos, unaware of the tension building beneath the surface. Sarah Palmer led another group past, her cheerful voice describing the palace's history, while Dan monitored Morris and his companions. Rachel caught his eye briefly. She'd positioned herself to have a better view of the memorial gardens, where 2 of Morris's group had drifted. Their coordination was too perfect to be coincidence. Dan had seen similar tactics during his military service, people creating diversions while others moved into position. The elderly veteran had settled on a bench near the gardens, adjusting his medals with careful hands. Dan noticed how Morris's group had gradually positioned themselves around the area, cutting off easy escape routes. Their behavior set off every alarm in Dan's trained mind. Captain Blackwood's words from training echoed in his thoughts. A royal guard's duty is to protect not just the palace, but what it represents: dignity, respect, and the safety of all who seek it. Looking at the vulnerable veteran surrounded by threats he couldn't see, Dan knew his duty went beyond standing at attention. The palace clock prepared to strike noon, and Dan could feel the moment of action approaching. Whatever Morris and his group planned, it would happen soon. He remained motionless, but every muscle was ready, every sense alert. This was what set the Royal Guards apart, the ability to maintain perfect composure while preparing to act at a moment's notice. Dan had trained for years to achieve this balance, and now, as he watched trouble brewing in the peaceful palace grounds, he knew that training would be put to the test. The air around Windsor Palace grew thick with tension as the clock struck. Noon. Daniel Mitchell's trained eyes never wavered from their forward position, but his peripheral vision caught every movement of Kevin Morris and his group. The suspicious men had spent the last hour positioning themselves strategically around the memorial gardens, their intentions becoming clearer with each passing minute. William "Bill" Harrison, the elderly veteran Dan had noticed earlier, remained, seated on the bench near the rose bushes. His medals caught the sunlight, drawing attention from passing tourists who smiled respectfully at the visible symbols of his service. But it wasn't just tourists who noticed. Morris and his companions kept throwing calculated glances in Bill's direction. The first clear sign of trouble came when Steve Walsh, the nervous one of Morris's group, deliberately bumped into a tourist near Bill's bench, creating a small commotion. Dan recognized this as a classic distraction technique. While everyone's attention focused on Walsh's exaggerated apologies, Mark Reynolds slipped closer to Bill's position. Rachel Cooper, from her post across the courtyard, shifted her stance slightly, their coded signal for increased vigilance. She'd noticed how Jake Turner, the most aggressive of Morris's group, had positioned himself near the garden's exit path. They were boxing the veteran in, using crowd control techniques that seemed far too professional for common troublemakers. Sarah Palmer's tour group passed between Dan and the gardens, temporarily blocking his view. When they cleared, Morris had moved closer to Bill, pretending to admire the roses while speaking quietly into what appeared to be a concealed phone or radio. This level of coordination raised Dan's concerns. These weren't opportunistic thugs, but an organized group with a specific plan. Captain Blackwood appeared near the east gate, engaging in what looked like casual conversation with George Matthews at security, but Dan knew his superior well enough to recognize he was positioning himself to monitor the situation. The captain's presence confirmed Dan's suspicions that something serious was developing. Bill Harrison seemed unaware of the net slowly closing around him. He sat peacefully, occasionally nodding to passing children who stared curiously at his medals. When a young girl asked her mother about them, Bill smiled warmly and began explaining what each one represented. The genuine pride and humility in his voice carried across the courtyard, reaching Dan's position. Morris chose this moment to make his first move. While Bill was distracted by the young girl, Walsh accidentally dropped a bag near the bench, spilling its contents. As Bill instinctively leaned forward to help, Reynolds moved in from behind, his hand reaching toward the veteran's jacket pocket. Dan's muscles tensed imperceptibly. Years of training screamed at him to intervene, but protocol demanded he maintain his post unless there was immediate danger. He watched as Bill politely waved off Walsh's exaggerated apologies, unaware of Reynolds behind him. Rachel's subtle finger tap against her rifle confirmed she'd seen it too. 3 taps, their signal for suspected pickpockets. But something about this felt different from ordinary theft. Morris and his group were too organized, too focused on Bill specifically, rather than targeting multiple tourists. The young girl and her mother moved away, leaving Bill more isolated. Morris seized the opportunity to sit on the far end of the bench, engaging Bill in what appeared to be casual conversation. Dan couldn't hear their words, but he noticed how Morris's eyes kept darting to Bill's medals, measuring their worth. Through the crowd, Dan caught glimpses of Turner moving closer, his hands concealed in his jacket pockets. The way he carried himself suggested he might be armed, not necessarily with a firearm, but something that made him confident enough to operate so boldly on palace grounds. Captain Blackwood had noticed too. He'd moved closer to the gardens, his presence both reassuring and concerning. If the captain himself felt the need to monitor the situation personally, the threat level was significant. A group of Japanese tourists gathered in front of Dan, their guide explaining the history of the Royal Guards. Through their excited chatter, Dan heard snippets of Morris's conversation with Bill. "Those are impressive medals, sir," Morris was saying, his voice carrying a false note of respect. "Must be worth quite a bit." Bill's reply was dignified but cautious. "Their worth isn't in money, young man. They represent service and sacrifice." Morris's laugh held no humor. "Everything has a price, old-timer. Everything." The implied threat in those words made Dan's jaw tighten slightly, the only external sign of his growing concern. He'd heard similar tones during his military service, usually right before situations turned violent. Sarah Palmer was leading another tour group toward the gardens. Dan silently hoped she'd notice something was amiss and alert security, but Morris's group was too skilled. They shifted positions naturally, making their presence seem completely innocent to casual observers. Reynolds had worked his way behind the bench again, pretending to take photos of the palace while actually documenting the area's security camera positions. Walsh kept creating small distractions, bumping into people or dropping things, testing how quickly palace security responded to minor incidents. Bill began to show signs of discomfort, clearly sensing something was wrong. He adjusted his position on the bench, trying to maintain some distance from Morris without appearing rude. His military training, though decades old, had clearly left him with good instincts. "Perhaps I should be going," Bill said, reaching for his walking stick. "My daughter will be expecting me." Morris's hand shot out, gripping Bill's arm in what appeared to be a friendly gesture, but was clearly restraining. "No rush, sir. We're just getting to know each other." Dan saw Rachel's fingers tighten on her rifle. She'd recognized the threatening gesture for what it was. Their training manual was clear. Any physical contact with a visitor that appeared threatening constituted grounds for intervention. But they needed to be certain to avoid causing unnecessary alarm or escalation. The palace clock chimed the quarter hour, its deep tones momentarily drowning out the crowd's chatter. In that brief moment, Dan saw Turner slip something from his pocket to Morris, something small that glinted in the sunlight before disappearing into Morris's jacket. Captain Blackwood had positioned himself near the garden's northern exit, cutting off one potential escape route for Morris's group. He caught Dan's eye briefly, giving an almost imperceptible nod. The message was clear: be ready. Bill tried to stand again, but Morris's grip tightened. "Those medals," Morris said, dropping all pretense of friendliness. "They're coming with us, one way or another." The threat was clear now, but Morris and his group had chosen their position well. They were partially hidden from most security cameras by the rose bushes, and the growing crowd of tourists provided cover for their actions. Walsh created another distraction, this time knocking over a potted plant near the path. As several tourists stopped to help right it, Reynolds moved in closer, effectively blocking Bill from public view. The coordination of their movements suggested this wasn't their first time targeting someone. Dan maintained his statue-like pose, but every sense was alert, tracking movements, calculating distances, evaluating threats. His military training had taught him to analyze situations rapidly, to identify potential weapons, escape routes, and civilian risks. Through the crowd's movement, Dan caught glimpses of what was happening. Morris had pulled Bill closer, speaking directly into his ear. The veteran's face showed no fear, only a quiet dignity that made the thug's actions seem even more despicable. "Your choice, old man," Morris was saying, loud enough now for Dan to hear. "Easy way or hard way, those medals are worth more than you think." Bill's voice, when he replied, carried the strength of his years of service. "These medals were earned with blood and sacrifice. They're not for sale or stealing." The tension in the air thickened. Dan could see Rachel preparing to move, her stance shifting ever so slightly. Captain Blackwood had begun moving casual, tourists away from the immediate area, his experienced eyes recognizing the signs of imminent confrontation. Morris's group had created a tight circle around Bill, their bodies blocking most observers' views. To tourists, it might have looked like a group of young men having a respectful conversation with a veteran. But Dan saw Turner's hand slip inside, his jacket again, saw Reynolds move to cut off Bill's escape route, saw Walsh position himself to block security's line of sight. The moment of decision was approaching. Dan knew that once Morris and his group made their move, things would escalate quickly. The safety of a vulnerable veteran was at stake, and with it, the honor of everything the palace grounds represented. Title, Group of Thugs Corner. A royal guard, they're shocked by his reaction. Continuing. Part 4. The choice. The critical moment arrived as Daniel Mitchell watched Morris's group tighten their circle around Bill Harrison. Time seemed to slow as Dan faced the most challenging decision of his career as a royal guard. The regulations were clear. Guards must maintain their posts unless there was an immediate threat to palace security or human life. But the scene unfolding before him challenged everything he believed about duty and honor. Dan's mind raced through his options, each carrying its own set of consequences. The palace protocol manual, which he'd memorized during training, specified exact circumstances under which a guard could break formation. Technically, a confrontation in the Memorial Gardens didn't qualify as a direct threat to palace security. Yet everything about Morris's group suggested they were dangerous professionals who wouldn't hesitate to harm an elderly veteran. Captain, Blackwood's voice echoed in his memory from training. Sometimes the hardest part of duty isn't following orders, it's knowing when to trust your instincts. The captain himself now stood at the edge of the gardens, his presence both reassuring and complicating. Any action Dan took would be witnessed by his superior officer. Rachel Cooper caught his eye from across the courtyard, her slight head tilt conveying her own struggle with the situation. They'd trained together, discussed scenarios like this during late-night guard shifts, but reality proved more complex than any training exercise. Morris's voice carried across the garden, low and threatening. Last chance, old-timer. Hand them over quietly or things get unpleasant. His hand gripped Bill's arm tighter, no longer bothering to disguise the action as friendly. Bill Harrison's response embodied the dignity of his generation. "Young man," he said firmly, "these medals represent the sacrifices of better men than you'll ever be. Do what you must, but I won't surrender them willingly." Dan felt his chest tighten at those words. Here was a man who'd faced real danger in war, now being threatened by thugs who couldn't comprehend the true value of what they sought to steal. The medals weren't just metal and ribbon, they were symbols of courage, sacrifice, and honor. Sarah Palmer approached with another tour group, unknowingly walking toward danger. Dan knew he had mere seconds to decide. If violence erupted near tourists, the situation could escalate dramatically. Protocol dictated that he should alert palace security through proper channels, wait for them to respond. But Dan saw Turner's hand move inside his jacket again, saw the glint of something metallic. Reynolds had positioned himself to block security, cameras, while Walsh created another distraction by dropping his phone, causing tourists to step back. Captain Blackwood was too far away to intervene quickly. Palace security would take precious minutes to respond through official channels. Dan thought of his father's words when he joined the Royal Guards. "The uniform isn't just for show, son. It represents a promise to protect." The weight of his ceremonial rifle felt heavier as he considered breaking formation. His career, his reputation, everything he'd worked for hung in the balance. The rule book was clear about guards maintaining their posts, about the chain of command, about proper procedures. Yet Dan also remembered another lesson from his military service. Sometimes rules must bend to serve their higher purpose. The royal guards existed to protect not just the palace, but what it represented: dignity, respect, and the safety of those who sought it. Morris's group had chosen their timing well. The changing of the guard would happen soon, creating confusion and cover for their escape. They'd studied the palace routines, planned their attack carefully. Dan realized they'd probably done this before, targeting vulnerable veterans for their medals. Bill attempted to stand again, his face showing discomfort but no fear. "I survived worse than you in the war, boy," he told Morris quietly. "Do your worst." The courage in those words made Dan's decision crystallize. Protocol existed to maintain order, but order without justice was meaningless. His position as a royal guard wasn't just about standing still, it was about standing for something. Rachel's subtle signal caught his eye. 3 quick taps on her rifle, their code for immediate threat. She'd seen something in Morris's group's movement that escalated the situation. Dan trusted her judgment implicitly. They'd worked together long enough to read each other's concerns. Through the crowd's movement, Dan saw Turner pull something, and from his jacket, a small blade, concealed but ready. The weapon's presence changed everything. Palace grounds were supposed to be safe, especially for veterans who'd earned the right to visit without fear. Captain Blackwood had begun moving through the crowd with purpose, but he was still too far away. Dan knew that waiting for official intervention might mean watching a veteran being robbed, or worse, his medals of honor stolen by those who couldn't comprehend their true value. The palace clock began to strike the quarter hour, its deep tones seeming to mark the moment of decision. Dan thought of everything the uniform represented, not just rules and tradition, but protection and justice. He thought of Bill Harrison's quiet dignity, of the sacrifices represented by those medals. Morris's voice turned harder. "Have it your way, old man." His grip tightened on Bill's arm while Turner moved closer, blade partially concealed but ready. Reynolds shifted to block more tourists' views, creating a screen for whatever was about to happen. Dan's military training had taught him to evaluate threats quickly. Morris's group showed signs of professional training. Their positioning, their coordination, their awareness of security cameras. They weren't common thugs, but organized criminals who had specifically targeted a vulnerable veteran. The decision crystallized in Dan's mind. Breaking formation would mean facing disciplinary action, possibly ending his career as a royal guard. But maintaining his post while watching violence unfold would break something far more important: his oath to protect, his personal honor, his duty to stand against injustice. Sarah Palmer's voice carried across the garden as she led her tour group closer, unaware of the danger. "The Royal Guards embody the highest traditions of service and protection," she was saying. Her words seemed to echo Dan's thoughts, reinforcing his growing conviction. Bill's medals caught the sunlight, each one representing moments of courage and sacrifice. Dan thought about what those medals meant. Not their monetary value, but the blood and courage they represented. He thought about the men and women who'd never returned to receive their medals, who'd given everything to protect others. The regulations about maintaining his post seemed to weigh against him, but Dan remembered Captain Blackwood's words during training. "Rules exist to serve justice, not replace it." The captain himself was moving faster now, recognizing the danger, but he wouldn't reach the scene in time. Rachel's position offered her a clearer view of what was happening. Her subtle signal confirmed Dan's assessment. Morris's group was moments away from violence. The blade in Turner's hand caught the light again, its presence an unmistakable threat to an elderly veteran's safety. Dan made his choice. His duty as a royal guard went beyond standing still and looking impressive. It meant protecting what the palace represented: dignity, honor, and the safety of those who'd earned the right to visit without fear. Breaking formation might end his career, but maintaining it while watching violence unfold would break something far more precious, his oath to protect and serve. The moment of decision had arrived. Dan's muscles tensed imperceptibly, ready for action. Whatever consequences came from breaking formation, he knew in his heart that protecting Bill Harrison wasn't just the right choice, it was the only choice a true royal guard could make. Morris's group tightened their circle, unaware that their carefully planned operation was about to meet unexpected resistance. They'd chosen their target well, planned their timing perfectly, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd threatened someone under the protection of a royal guard who understood that true duty sometimes required breaking rules to uphold their deeper purpose. The next few moments would change everything: Dan's career, the safety of a veteran, and the very meaning of what it meant to be a royal guard. But as he prepared to act, Dan felt a deep certainty that he was upholding the true spirit of his position, even if it meant breaking its letter. Time seemed to crystallize into a single moment as Daniel Mitchell broke formation. His movement, practiced and precise, carried him away from his post with military efficiency. The gasps of nearby tourists barely registered as he covered the distance to the memorial gardens in long, measured strides. Morris's group didn't notice him immediately. Their attention focused on Bill Harrison and his medals. Dan's footsteps on the cobblestones finally caught their attention, and Morris's head snapped up, eyes widening in surprise. None of them had expected a royal guard to abandon his post. "Step away from him," Dan commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his position. He moved with calculated precision, positioning himself between Bill and his would-be attackers. Now, the tourists around them fell silent, phones rising to record what was happening. Morris recovered quickly from his surprise, a sneer crossing his scarred face. "This isn't your business, soldier boy. Go back to playing statue." Dan's training took over, his eyes cataloging threats and positions. Turner still held the concealed blade, while Reynolds had shifted to cut off any potential escape route. Walsh looked nervous, his eyes darting between Dan and the growing crowd of onlookers. "I won't repeat myself," Dan said, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. "Step away." Rachel Cooper had adjusted her position, maintaining her post but ready to provide support if needed. Captain Blackwood was moving through the crowd with purpose, but he was still too far to intervene directly. Morris's sneer deepened. "Or what? You'll get in trouble for leaving your post. We all know you're just for show." He reached for Bill's medals again, testing Dan's resolve. Dan's response was immediate and controlled. His hand caught Morris's wrist in a grip that spoke of years of combat training. "Those medals stay where they are." He applied just enough, pressure to make his point without causing injury. Yet, the crowd had grown larger, phones recording every moment. Sarah Palmer was trying to move her tour group away from the confrontation, while George Matthews at security was already calling for backup. "You're making a mistake," Morris growled, trying to pull his arm free. Dan's grip remained firm, his stance perfectly balanced. Behind him, Bill Harrison had risen to his feet, his military bearing evident despite his age. Turner moved first, the blade now fully visible in his hand. Dan had expected this. His free hand deflected Turner's attack with practiced ease, using the man's momentum against him. Turner stumbled, nearly falling into a rose bush. "That was your second mistake," Dan said calmly, "bringing a weapon onto palace grounds." His voice carried across the now silent garden. "Your first was threatening a veteran." Reynolds tried to circle behind Dan, but years of military training had taught him never to lose track of multiple opponents. Without releasing Morris, Dan shifted his stance, keeping all four men in his field of vision. "Last chance," Dan announced. "Leave now or face the consequences." Morris attempted to break free again, this time with more force. Dan used the movement against him. redirecting his energy to spin him away from Bill. The maneuver was smooth, professional, a reminder that royal guards were more than ceremonial figures. Walsh, seeing how quickly the situation had turned, started to back away. "Kevin," he called to Morris, "this isn't worth it. There's too many people watching." But Morris wasn't ready to give up. "Get him!" he snarled at Turner and Reynolds. "He can't stop all of us." They came at Dan together, but their coordination had broken down. Fear and anger made their movements sloppy. Dan released Morris with a push that sent him stumbling. They met the attack with calculated precision. Turner swung the blade again, but Dan had trained for this. He deflected the strike, trapped Turner's arm, and disarmed him in one fluid motion. The blade clattered to the cobblestones as Turner yelped in pain. Reynolds threw a wild punch that Dan easily avoided. His counterstrike was controlled, designed to disable without causing serious injury. Reynolds doubled over, all fight gone. From him, Morris had regained his balance and charged forward, rage overtaking caution. Dan met him with textbook defensive techniques, using Morris's own momentum to take him down. The impact with the ground drove the air from Morris's lungs. Within seconds, all four attackers were neutralized. Dan stood over them, his posture perfect despite the exertion. Behind him, Bill Harrison watched with professional appreciation, one soldier recognizing another's skill. Captain Blackwood arrived with palace security in tow. "Well handled, Mitchell," he said quietly, as officers began securing the scene. His tone carried both approval and concern for the aftermath of Dan's actions. The crowd erupted in applause, phones still recording everything. Sarah Palmer's voice carried over the noise. "As I said, the Royal Guards are more than ceremonial figures. They are highly trained professionals dedicated to protection and service." Dan maintained his professional demeanor, though his heart raced from the confrontation. He turned to Bill. "Are you all right, sir?" Bill straightened his medals with careful hands. "Thanks to you, son. It does an old soldier's heart good to see there are still men of honor in uniform." Rachel caught Dan's eye from her post, giving him their subtle signal for "well done." She had maintained her position, ensuring the palace remained protected while Dan handled the threat. Morris and his group were being handcuffed by palace security. "You'll regret this," Morris spat, but his threat sounded hollow now. "You broke protocol. You'll lose your position." Dan didn't respond. He knew the consequences of his actions would come later. For now, he focused on ensuring Bill's safety as medical personnel arrived to check him for any injuries from Morris's rough handling. Captain Blackwood was already coordinating with local police, who had arrived with impressive speed. The captain's expression was unreadable, but Dan noticed how he emphasized to the officers that a veteran had been threatened on palace grounds. George Matthews approached with a concerned expression. "The whole thing's on security cameras," he reported. "Clear evidence of their attack and the guards' reasonable response." The crowd slowly dispersed under the direction of palace staff, though many lingered to capture final photos and videos of the aftermath. The incident would undoubtedly appear on social media within minutes. Dan knew questions would come later about breaking formation, about proper procedure, about the chain of command. But watching Bill Harrison stand tall among the roses, his medals catching the sunlight, Dan felt no regret for his decision. "I served 40 years ago," Bill said quietly to Dan. "Different uniform, same spirit. You did the right thing, son. Whatever comes next, remember that." Captain Blackwood overheard the exchange. His expression softened slightly as he watched Morris and his group being led away. "Report to my office in an hour, Mitchell," he said. "We'll discuss the procedural aspects then." Dan nodded, knowing the conversation wouldn't be easy. But as he looked at Bill's medals, each one representing sacrifice and courage, he knew he'd made the only choice a true guardian could make. The palace clock struck again, marking the passing of time. Dan had broken formation, violated protocol, and faced armed attackers. But he had also protected a veteran, upheld the true spirit of his duty, and demonstrated that royal guards were more than ceremonial figures. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Daniel Mitchell stood steady as palace security processed Morris and his group, his military bearing unchanged despite the chaos he'd just navigated. The adrenaline still coursed through his system, but years of training helped him maintain his professional composure. Captain Thomas Blackwood orchestrated the scene with practiced efficiency, directing officers while keeping curious tourists at a respectful distance. The Memorial Gardens had become an impromptu crime scene, with local police documenting evidence and taking statements from witnesses. "The blade, sir," Dan reported formally to his captain, pointing to where Turner's weapon lay on the cobblestones. They were prepared to use force. The implication hung in the air. This hadn't been a simple attempt at theft, but a potentially violent assault on palace grounds. Blackwood nodded grimly. "Good eye, Mitchell, though we'll need to discuss your methods." His tone carried both approval and warning. The captain turned to direct an evidence technician toward the weapon, his expression thoughtful. Bill Harrison remained nearby, speaking with a police officer. His voice carried across the garden, steady and clear as he described the events. "They surrounded me gradually, very professional about it. If the guard hadn't intervened..." He glanced at his medals, touching them gently. "Well, let's say the outcome would have been quite different." Rachel Cooper maintained her post, but Dan could read concern in her subtle signals. They both knew that breaking formation, regardless of the justification, carried serious consequences. The Royal Guard's reputation rested on their discipline and adherence to protocol. Sarah Palmer approached with a concerned expression. He cancelled the remaining morning tours," she reported to Captain Blackwood, "though I must say this incident has generated quite a bit of interest." She gestured discreetly to the phones, still recording from beyond the security perimeter. Dan knew the significance of those recordings. By tomorrow, possibly sooner, this incident would be all over social media. The palace would have to respond officially, and his actions would be scrutinized by superiors far above Captain Blackwood's rank. Morris, now handcuffed and waiting for transport, couldn't resist a final taunt. "Hope it was worth it, soldier boy. You'll be looking for a new job by sunset." His scarred face twisted in a sneer, but Dan noticed the tremor in his voice, bravado masking fear. "That's enough from you," Officer Claire Bennett interrupted, leading Morris toward a waiting police vehicle. She paused beside Dan. "We'll need your statement, but it can wait until you've spoken with your superiors." Dan appreciated her understanding. The next few hours would be crucial for his career. He'd broken one of the Royal Guard's most fundamental rules, and no amount of justification could change that fact. Bill Harrison approached, his bearing straight despite his age. "I'd like to make something clear to everyone," he announced, voice carrying the authority of his years. "This young man didn't just protect my medals. He protected what they represent: honor, sacrifice, and the duty to stand against wrongdoing." The gathered officers paused, respectful of the veteran's words. Even Captain Blackwood's stern expression softened slightly. Bill continued, his hand resting on his medals. "I've seen courage in many forms during my service. Today I saw it in a guard who chose right over easy." George Matthews appeared with a tablet displaying security footage. "Sir," he addressed Captain Blackwood, "you'll want to see this, clear evidence of premeditation. They'd been watching the gardens for hours, coordinating their movements." Blackwood reviewed the footage, his frown deepening. "Good work, Matthews. This helps establish the threat level." He glanced at Dan, "though it doesn't change the fact that protocol was broken." The palace clock chimed, marking another quarter hour. Dan knew his meeting with Blackwood approached, the moment when the real consequences of his actions would begin to unfold. Yet watching Morris and his group being led away, seeing Bill's medals safe on his chest, he felt a deep certainty about his choice. Rachel caught his eye again, signaling a subtle warning. More senior officers had arrived, drawn by reports of the incident. Their presence suggested the situation had escalated beyond a simple disciplinary matter. "Mitchell," Captain Blackwood called, his tone formal. "My office, now." The earlier one-hour deadline had clearly been revised given the situation's gravity. Dan squared his shoulders and followed his captain, aware of the eyes tracking his movement. Palace staff, tourists, fellow guards, all watching to see how this would play out. Bill Harrison's voice carried after him. "Stand tall, son. You did us proud today." The walk to Blackwood's office felt longer than usual. They passed through corridors where Dan normally stood guard, past windows overlooking the gardens where tourists were still trying to photograph the aftermath of the confrontation. Inside the office, Blackwood closed the door with deliberate care. "Sit down, Mitchell." He took his own seat behind the desk, spreading out several documents. "Let's begin with the obvious. You broke formation without direct orders." "Yes, sir." Dan's response was immediate and honest. "You engaged in physical confrontation with civilians on palace grounds." "Yes, sir." "And you did this knowing it violated at least 3 sections of the Royal Guard Protocol Manual." Blackwood tapped a thick volume on his desk. "Yes, sir." Dan maintained his direct gaze. "I believed immediate action was necessary to prevent harm to a vulnerable visitor." Blackwood leaned back, studying him. "The protocol exists for a reason. Mitchell, we can't have guards breaking formation every time they perceive a threat. It would undermine everything we represent." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Blackwood's voice sharpened. "Because right now, social media is exploding with videos of a royal guard abandoning his post. Every tourist with a phone captured what happened. The palace will have to respond officially." Dan absorbed this in silence. He'd known there would be consequences, but the scale was becoming clearer. "However," Blackwood continued, his tone softening slightly, "we also have clear evidence of an organized attempt to rob and potentially harm a veteran on palace grounds. The security footage shows their preparation, their coordination, and we have a witness list that includes one of our most respected tour guides and numerous visitors." He shuffled through the papers on his desk. "Initial reports suggest Morris's a group may be connected to similar incidents at other historical sites. They target elderly veterans, stealing medals for the black market." Dan's jaw tightened at this confirmation of his suspicions. "They were too well organized for random troublemakers, sir." "Agreed." Blackwood pulled out another document, which brings us to the complicated part. Your actions, while against protocol, may have helped break up a larger criminal operation. The police are very interested in questioning Morris and his associates about other incidents. Hope flickered in Dan's chest, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "That wasn't my consideration at the time, sir. I was focused on the immediate threat to Mr. Harrison." "Of course you were." Blackwood's voice carried a hint of approval. "That's what makes this situation so complex. You broke the rules, Mitchell, but you may have done exactly what a royal guard is truly meant to do: protect those who need protection." The captain stood, moving to the window overlooking the gardens. "The palace will have to respond to this incident. There will be an official investigation. Your future as a royal guard hangs in the balance." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Blackwood turned back to face him. "Because right now, I have senior officers demanding your immediate dismissal. I also have a decorated veteran singing your praises to anyone who'll listen, and social media calling you a hero." Dan remained silent, accepting the complexity of his situation. For now, Blackwood continued, you're suspended from regular duties pending review. Report to Lieutenant Stevens for temporary assignment to the training division. We'll need your formal statement, and you should expect to be questioned by both palace officials and police investigators. Yes, sir. Dan stood, recognizing the dismissal in Blackwood's tone, and Mitchell, the captain's voice, stopped him at the door. Off the record, you're not the first guard to face this kind of choice. The difference is, you'll have to face the consequences in the age of social media and viral videos. Dan nodded, understanding the added complexity this brought to his situation. As he left Blackwood's office, he caught a glimpse of the gardens. Through a window, Bill Harrison still stood there, speaking with Officer Bennett, his medals catching the sunlight. Whatever came next, Dan knew he'd chosen right over easy, protection over protocol. As he headed to find Lieutenant Stevens, he carried that certainty with him, a shield against the storm he knew was coming. The consequences of Daniel Mitchell's actions rippled through Windsor Palace like waves in a still pond. By late afternoon, the incident had transformed from a local security matter into something much larger. Social media exploded with videos of the confrontation, each new angle revealing different details of how a royal guard had broken formation to protect an elderly veteran. In the guards' quarter, Dan sat at his desk reviewing paperwork for Lieutenant Stevens. His temporary reassignment to the training division felt both like punishment and refuge. Around him, fellow guards passed by, some offering subtle nods of support, others maintaining careful distance. You've started quite the storm, Rachel, Hooper said, entering with 2 cups of coffee. She placed one on his desk, her expression concerned. Have you seen the news? Dan shook his head, focusing on the incident report in front of him. Every detail needed to be perfect, knowing his words would be scrutinized by multiple departments. Rachel pulled up a news website on her phone. Palace Guard breaks protocol to save veteran, screamed one headline. Royal Guard shows true meaning of duty, declared another. Comment sections overflowed with debate about rules versus moral obligations. That's not the half of it, George Matthews added, joining them with a tablet displaying security footage. Police just confirmed Morris and his group are linked to at least 6 similar incidents across the country. They've been targeting veterans at historical sites for months. Dan absorbed this information while carefully documenting his observations of Morris's group's coordinated movements. Their positioning was too professional, he noted. They knew exactly how to avoid camera angles. Speaking of cameras, Rachel said, scrolling through her phone, Sarah Palmer's tour group captured everything. One of her visitors posted a video that's gone viral, over 1 million views already. Lieutenant Stevens appeared in the doorway, his expression stern. Mitchell, a word. He gestured for Dan to follow him to a private office. Inside, Stevens closed the door and sat behind his desk. The palace press office is preparing an official statement. They need to know if you're willing to speak with selected media outlets. Dan's surprise must have shown on his face. Sir, this incident has sparked public interest in the Royal Guards. Some higher-ups think it's an opportunity to educate people about what we really do. Stevens leaned forward. Others think we should minimize exposure and wait for it to blow over. Before Dan could respond, his phone buzzed with a message from Officer Claire Bennett. Morris talking. Claims targeting veterans across multiple locations. Need your statement ASAP. The ripples were spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Dan looked up to find Stevens watching him expectantly. Sir, my only concern was protecting Mr. Harrison. I'm not interested in publicity. Stevens nodded approvingly. Good answer, but this may be bigger than your preferences. Captain Blackwood wants to see you again at 1600 hours. As Dan left Stevens's office, he passed the break room where several guards watched news coverage of the incident. The sound carried into the hallway. Sources say the Royal Guard in question, identified as Daniel Mitchell, has an exemplary service record. Rachel intercepted him in the corridor. "Bill Harrison's family is here," she said quietly. "They're asking to speak with you." Dan followed her to a small conference room where Bill sat with a middle-aged woman who shared his strong features. "My daughter Margaret," Bill introduced her. "She insisted on coming when she heard what happened." Margaret Harrison stood, extending her hand. "Thank you for protecting my father. Those medals mean everything to him." "Just doing my duty, Ma'am," Dan replied automatically. Bill's laugh was warm. "That's what real soldiers always say, isn't it? Even when they go above and beyond." Margaret's expression grew serious. "We've heard you might face disciplinary action. Father wants to speak at your review hearing." Dan started to protest, but Bill raised a hand. "Son, I've spent decades wearing medals that remind me of times when following orders meant watching bad things happen. Today, you showed what it really means to serve." Their conversation was interrupted by Captain Blackwood's arrival. "Mr. Harrison, Ms. Harrison," he greeted them formally. "I apologize, but I need to borrow Mitchell. Things are developing quickly." In Blackwood's office, the atmosphere was tense. Senior palace officials had been calling all afternoon, demanding updates. The captain looked tired but focused. "Morris is cooperating with police," he began without preamble. "Their operation was larger than we suspected. Professional thieves targeting military medals for private collectors." Dan processed this information. "That explains their tactics, sir. They moved like trained operators." "Exactly." Blackwood spread several photographs across his desk, security camera stills from other historical sites showing similar incidents. "They've hit museums, memorials, even military ceremonies, always targeting elderly veterans, always focused on medals. The palace incident was their boldest move yet," a new voice added. Assistant Commissioner Sandra Wells entered the office, nodding to both men. "And thanks to Guard Mitchell's intervention, we may have broken their entire network." Wells placed a file on Blackwood's desk. "Morris is naming names, hoping for leniency. The organization spans 3 countries, trafficking in stolen military memorabilia. Conservative estimates put their total takes in the millions." Dan's mind flashed to Bill Harrison's medals, remembering Morris's words about their worth. "They saw the medals as merchandise," he said quietly, "not symbols of service." "Precisely," Wells agreed. "Which is why your actions, while technically against protocol, may have helped us crack a significant case." Blackwood studied Dan carefully. "The Palace Review Board meets tomorrow morning. This information changes the context of your actions considerably." "Sir, my decision wasn't based on any of this," Dan stated firmly. "I saw a veteran in danger and acted." "We know," Wells smiled. "That's partly why I'm here. The police commissioner wants to formally commend your actions." Before Dan could respond, Rachel appeared at the door. "Sir, sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this." She held up her phone, displaying a social media post that had just gone viral. Someone had compiled security footage with tourist videos showing the entire incident from multiple angles. The edited sequence captured everything. Morris's group surrounding Bill, Dan's decisive intervention, the professional takedown of armed attackers. But it was the comments below that caught everyone's attention. Veterans from around the world were sharing the video, adding their own stories of similar encounters with medal thieves. Some had lost precious decorations to criminals who saw only monetary value in their sacrifice. "This is bigger than one incident now," Wells observed. "It's becoming a conversation about protecting our veterans and their symbols of service." Blackwood's phone buzzed with a message. He read it, his expression shifting. The palace press office has made a decision. They want to get ahead of this story. Dan felt a weight settle in his stomach. Despite the apparent positive developments, he knew his career still hung in the balance. Breaking formation remained a serious breach of protocol, regardless of the outcome. Mitchell, Blackwood said, his tone softening slightly, whatever happens at tomorrow's review, remember this. Sometimes doing the right thing comes at a cost. The question is whether you can live with the alternative. As if to underscore his words, another message arrived. This one from Sarah Palmer. Tourist bookings for palace tours had spiked, with many specifically asking about the Royal Guard's role in protection and security. The ripples keep spreading, Rachel commented from the doorway. Dan nodded, understanding that his single decision to break formation had set in motion events far beyond the palace walls. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, he could take comfort in knowing that somewhere in Windsor, an elderly veteran's medals remained where they belonged, over a heart that had served with honor. Evening settled over Windsor Palace, casting long shadows across the ancient stones. Daniel Mitchell sat alone in the guards' quarter, his uniform jacket carefully hung nearby, reflecting on the day's events. The quiet hours after sunset usually brought peace, but tonight they carried the weight of uncertainty. Through the window, he could see tourists still lingering near the memorial gardens, phones raised to capture the location where a royal guard had broken years of tradition to protect a veteran. The roses that had witnessed the confrontation swayed gently in the evening breeze, oblivious to their role in the day's drama. "Thought I'd find you here," Rachel Cooper's voice broke through his contemplation. She carried 2 fresh cups of coffee, a peace offering for the troubled hours ahead. "Bill Harrison left something for you." She placed a small envelope on his desk. Inside, Dan found a photograph, black and white, yellowed with age. It showed a young Bill Harrison in his military uniform, medals gleaming on his chest. The handwritten note beneath read, "Sometimes duty calls us to break ranks, Bill." "He wanted you to understand why those medals meant so much," Rachel explained, settling into a nearby chair. "Each one has a story." Dan studied the photograph, noting the pride in young Bill's stance. Morris and his group saw them as merchandise. They couldn't understand what they really represented. Speaking of Morris, Rachel pulled out her phone, displaying a police update. "They're still questioning him. Apparently, the operation went deeper than anyone suspected. They had buyers lined up, collectors who didn't care how the medals were obtained." The thought made Dan's jaw tighten. He remembered the look in Morris's eyes when he'd grabbed Bill's arm, the casual disregard for what those medals meant to their rightful owner. Captain Blackwood appeared in the doorway, his usual formal demeanor softened by the late hour. "Mitchell, a moment." He gestured toward his office. Inside, the captain's desk was covered with papers, reports, statements, and printouts of news coverage. "The review board meets at 900 tomorrow," he began, shuffling through documents. "But there are some things you should know first." He pushed forward several photographs, security camera stills from other historical sites. Morris's group had been planning the palace operation for weeks. They chose their timing carefully, studied our routines. Dan leaned forward, recognizing the tactical approach in the images. They weren't just thieves. They had military-style training. "Correct." Blackwood pulled out another file. "Some of them are former security personnel who turned their skills to crime. They specifically targeted elderly veterans, counting on their vulnerability." The revelation hit Dan hard. These weren't opportunistic criminals, but calculated predators who deliberately chose victims least able to resist. "There's more," Blackwood continued. "Bill Harrison wasn't a random target. They'd researched him, knew which medals he carried. Some of his decorations are particularly rare." Rachel, who had followed them in, gasped softly. They were hunting him. Precisely. Blackwood's expression darkened, which makes your intervention, while against protocol, potentially life-saving. Harrison might not have survived if they'd cornered him somewhere less public. Dan remembered the blade in Turner's hand, the professional way they'd isolated their target. They weren't just going to take the medals, were they, sir? No. The captain's response was grim. Based on Morris's confession, they were prepared to use whatever force necessary. These men had lost any sense of honor long ago. A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Claire Bennett entered, looking tired but satisfied. Sorry to interrupt, but you'll want to hear this. Morris just gave us names, collectors, buyers, even other team members. The network spans 3 continents. She placed her notebook on Blackwood's desk. They've hit military museums, memorial sites, even veterans' homes. The palace was meant to be their biggest score yet. Until a royal guard broke formation, Rachel added softly. Dan absorbed this information, understanding now why Morris's group had seemed so professional. They weren't common thugs, but trained operators who had turned their skills against the very veterans they might once have protected. The media's running with the story, Bennett continued, but they're focusing on the protection aspect, how a guard's quick action prevented a serious crime. The palace might want to consider using this to highlight the real role of the royal guards. Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. The public often sees the ceremonial side. They forget we're real guards with real responsibilities. A new message appeared on Bennett's phone. Update from the station. They've recovered stolen medals from 3 other incidents. They're working to return them to their rightful owners. The news brought some comfort, but Dan's thoughts returned to Bill Harrison, to the proud way he wore his medals, despite the threats he'd faced. Sir, he addressed Blackwood, whatever the review board decides, I can't regret acting. The captain studied him for a long moment. No one's asking you to, Mitchell. The question isn't whether you were right to protect Harrison. It's how we balance tradition and duty when they conflict. Rachel's phone buzzed with another update. Social media's still buzzing. Someone started a hashtag campaign about protecting veterans. Bill Harrison's story is inspiring others to speak up about similar experiences. That's part of what we need to discuss, Blackwood said. The palace press office wants to make a statement, not just about this incident, but about the larger issue of protecting our veterans and their symbols of service. He pushed forward another document. They're suggesting you speak at a press conference, explain why you chose to break formation. It could help change public perception of the Royal Guards. Dan hesitated. Sir, I didn't act for publicity. We know, Bennett interjected. That's exactly why your words would carry weight. People need to understand that behind the ceremony, we're all devoted to protection and service. A knock at the door revealed Sarah Palmer, still in her tour guide uniform. Sorry to interrupt, but you should see this. She held up her tablet, displaying visitor comments from the palace website. Tourists who had witnessed the incident had posted their stories, describing not just the confrontation, but the dignity with which the Royal Guard had acted. Many commented on how it had changed their perception of the Guard's role. It's not just about one incident anymore, Sarah explained. People are talking about respect, about protecting our heritage, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. Dan read some of the comments, touched by how his split-second decision had resonated with so many people. One comment particularly caught his eye. Today I saw that sometimes the greatest tradition is knowing when to break with tradition. Blackwood cleared his throat. The review board will still need to address the protocol violation, but they'll also consider the broader impact of your actions. Sometimes, Mitchell, breaking the rules serves a higher purpose. Rachel stood by the window, looking out at the gardens now empty of tourists. "The roses are still standing," she observed quietly, "even after all the chaos today." Dan understood her metaphor. Like the roses, some things remained constant. A duty, honor, the obligation to protect those who had served. His decision to break formation had created ripples that were still spreading, but at its core, it had been about those unchanging values. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Blackwood said, gathering his papers, "remember this: you maintained the true spirit of your position, even while breaking its rules. That's something the review board will have to consider." As the others filed out, Dan remained in the captain's office, looking at Bill Harrison's photograph. The young soldier in the image had stood against different threats, but the principles remained the same: courage, duty, and the willingness to act when action was needed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, Dan found peace in knowing he had upheld those principles, even at the cost of breaking formation. Sometimes he realized the greatest service to tradition was knowing when tradition must bend to serve its higher purpose. The morning of the review board dawned grey and cool over Windsor Palace. Daniel Mitchell arrived early, his dress uniform impeccable despite a sleepless night. The guards' quarter hummed with unusual tension. Everyone knew this day would set precedents far beyond one guard's actions. "They're ready for you," Rachel Cooper announced, appearing at his desk. Her expression carried both concern and support. "Captain Blackwood wants you in the main conference room." The walk through the palace corridors felt longer than usual. Tourist groups were already gathering outside, many carrying signs supporting the Guardian Guard, as social media had dubbed him. Dan caught glimpses of them through the windows, their presence a reminder of how far this incident had spread. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was formal and tense. The review board consisted of 5 senior officials, including Captain Blackwood and 2 high-ranking palace administrators. Assistant Commissioner Wells sat in an observer's capacity, representing the police department's interests. Guard Mitchell, the senior reviewer, Colonel James Patterson, began. "We're here to examine the events of yesterday and their implications for palace security protocols. However, new developments require us to expand our focus." He gestured to Wells, who opened a thick file. Overnight, Morris provided additional information about their operation. The palace incident was meant to be their showcase, proving they could strike anywhere, even under the tightest security. Dan absorbed this information, maintaining his professional stance. The stakes had risen far beyond a simple protocol, a violation. "Furthermore," Wells continued, "we've identified their primary buyer, a private collector with connections to organized crime. He specifically requested medals from high-security locations, viewing them as trophies." Colonel Patterson leaned forward. "Mitchell, your actions didn't just prevent one theft. You disrupted a criminal enterprise that was targeting our military heritage. However, this creates new complications." Before he could elaborate, the door opened. Bill Harrison entered, supported by his daughter Margaret. Behind them came Sarah, Palmer, and George Matthews, all apparently summoned to testify. "Mr. Harrison insisted on speaking first," Captain Blackwood explained. The colonel nodded, gesturing for Bill to take a seat. "I won't take long," Bill began, his voice strong despite his age. "But this board needs to understand something. Those men weren't just after medals. They wanted to steal our history, our sacrifice, our honor." He touched his medals, each one catching the morning light. "Guard Mitchell didn't just protect me. He protected what these represent: courage, duty, the willingness to stand against wrong, no matter the cost." Margaret Harrison stepped forward, placing a document on the table. "We've compiled statements from other veterans who were targeted by this group. Some lost medals that had been in their families for generations." Sarah Palmer added her own report. "Tourist feedback has been overwhelming. People are sharing stories of how this incident changed their view of the Royal Guards, from ceremonial figures to real protectors. Colonel Patterson studied the documents. The public relations aspect is significant. However, our primary concern must be the precedent this sets. We can't have guards breaking formation whenever they perceive a threat. "With respect, sir," George Matthews interjected, bringing up security footage on a large screen. "This wasn't a perceived threat. Our cameras caught their entire operation. They had studied our routines, found blind spots, planned escape routes. They were professionals targeting a vulnerable veteran." Assistant Commissioner Wells stood, adding her perspective. "Morris's group has already been linked to dozens of similar crimes. They specifically chose elderly veterans, counting on their inability to resist. Some victims were seriously injured." The revelation sent a ripple through the room. Dan's jaw tightened, understanding now the full scope of what he'd prevented. "There's more," Wells continued. "Based on Morris's confession, they had a contingency plan if confronted. They were armed and prepared to use force. Guard Mitchell's intervention likely prevented serious violence." Colonel Patterson turned to Dan. "Your actions, while against protocol, may have saved lives. However, we must consider the broader implications. Other guards might use this as precedent to break formation for less critical situations." "Sir," Dan responded carefully, "my decision wasn't based on creating precedent. I saw an immediate threat to a vulnerable veteran and acted to protect him. That's the core of our duty, whether we're in formation or not." Captain Blackwood nodded slightly, approval flickering in his eyes. "The question before this board isn't just about one incident. It's about how we balance tradition with our fundamental mission of protection." Rachel Cooper, who had been monitoring social media, spoke up. "The public response supports this view. People are calling for a review of protocols, asking why ceremonial duties should prevent guards from protecting visitors." "That's precisely our concern," Colonel Patterson replied. "We can't have the public thinking guards will abandon their posts for every perceived threat. The palace's security depends on maintaining order and discipline." Bill Harrison's voice cut through the debate. "When I served, we had a saying, 'Rules exist to serve honor, not replace it.' Guard Mitchell upheld the true spirit of his position, even while breaking its letter." The room fell silent, considering his words. Outside, tourist voices drifted through the windows, many discussing the incident that had brought them to the palace. Assistant Commissioner Wells consulted her notes. "The police department's position is clear. Guard Mitchell's actions helped break open a major criminal operation. His intervention saved more than just one veteran's medals." Sarah Palmer added another perspective. "From the public's view, this incident has humanized the Royal Guards. People see them now as real protectors, not just tourist attractions." Colonel Patterson raised his hand for silence. "We understand the positive outcomes. However, we must consider future implications. Guard Mitchell, what would you say to other guards who might use your actions as justification to break protocol?" Dan stood straighter, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, I would tell them what my training taught me, that our first duty is protection. Protocol exists to maintain order, but order without purpose is empty ceremony." Captain Blackwood nodded approvingly. "Well said, Mitchell. The question isn't whether to maintain protocol, but how to ensure it serves its true purpose." The review board members exchanged glances, their decisions seemingly weighing heavier with each new revelation. The stakes had grown far beyond one. Guards' actions. This would set precedent for how the Royal Guards balance tradition with their protective duties. Margaret Harrison spoke up again. My father's medals represent sacrifice and courage. Guard Mitchell showed those same qualities by choosing to protect rather than simply observe. Isn't that what the Royal Guards truly stand for? As the board prepared to deliberate, Dan stood at attention, aware that his actions had sparked a deeper examination of the Royal Guard's role in modern times. Whatever their decision, the ripples would continue to spread, challenging old assumptions about duty, protocol, and the true meaning of service. The review board's decision came swiftly, but with careful consideration. Colonel Patterson stood, his expression measured as he delivered their verdict. Guard Daniel Mitchell, he began formally, this board has reviewed your actions extensively. While breaking formation violated our most basic protocols, we cannot ignore the extraordinary circumstances and positive outcomes of your intervention. He glanced at his fellow board members before continuing. Therefore, this board has decided that while protocol was breached, your actions upheld the higher purpose of the Royal Guards. You will receive a formal commendation for protecting a veteran under threat, along with 2 weeks of additional training to reinforce proper response procedures. Captain Blackwood's slight smile confirmed this was the best possible outcome. The decision acknowledged the protocol violation, while recognizing the validity of Dan's actions. The following weeks brought significant changes to Windsor Palace. Security protocols were reviewed and updated, incorporating lessons learned from the incident. The Royal Guards remained ceremonial figures, but with clearer guidelines about responding to threats. Bill Harrison became a regular visitor to the palace, often stopping to chat with Dan during quiet moments. His medals, now safer than ever, continued to shine in the sunlight, symbols of courage that had inspired another generation to stand against wrongdoing. Morris and his group faced serious charges, their network of medal theft finally exposed and dismantled. Veterans across the country began receiving recovered medals, each return ceremony a small victory for justice and honor. Dan resumed his regular duties, standing tall at his post near the East Gate. Tourists still took photos, but now they often shared stories about the guard who chose protection over protocol, who showed that true duty sometimes required breaking ranks. One quiet evening, as the sun set over Windsor Palace, Captain Blackwood found Dan at his post. You changed things, Mitchell, he said quietly. Reminded us all what it really means to be a Royal Guard. Dan maintained his formal stance, but pride filled his chest. He had upheld the true spirit of his position, protected those who needed protection, and shown that sometimes the greatest tradition was knowing when tradition must bend to serve its higher purpose. The roses in the memorial gardens continued to bloom, witnesses to a moment when duty called for more than standing still. And if you visit Windsor Palace today, you might see a royal guard at attention, looking like a ceremonial figure, but ready, always ready to protect what truly matters. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.